Hello, fiendlings. How the hell are ya? Welcome to the podcast presentation of The Black Evolution, the fourth book in the series. Unlike the previous novels, Arrival and Outbreak, Evolution should be considered a direct sequel to The Black. For those of you who have wondered what happened to Catfish and Shauna, this novel should satisfy your curiosity. If you read the other two books in the series, you'll see quite a few familiar faces as well. A quick note before we get going. I have a new novel out called The Medusa Zone. It takes place in deep water in the Gulf of Mexico and features what I think is a rather unique creature. Support the podcast and keep it free by following the link in the show notes and purchasing any of my novels in any format. Or spread the word. That works too. For now, though, sit back and relax and let the waves wash over you. Be safe, have a great week, and we'll talk again real soon. Here's episode 1 of The Black Evolution. Chapter 1. She spent 3 long days in the lifeboat after Liger sank. 3 days and nights of ocean waves buffeting the mostly empty craft and pushing it further and farther away from where so many had died. Farther away from it, but not the memory of it. Catfish, the only other survivor, had been concussed severely. She tended to him as best she could, comforting him when he was awake and holding him when he wasn't. Even when he was unconscious, the feel of his body against hers was enough to set her at ease. She'd been afraid to fall asleep the first night. The moon, a bare sliver in the dark sky, did little to illuminate the ocean beyond the portholes, much less the lifeboat's interior. The darkness seemed to crowd her, envelop her, and worst of all were the shadows. The storm had moved on, as had its malevolent clouds, but it wasn't long before wisps of white and gray appeared against the day's dark blue sky. Was another storm coming? The shivers that racked her weren't just for the possibility of more water, thunder, lightning, and the inevitable fear of the small craft capsizing and dropping her and Catfish into 10,000 meters of water. No. If the light disappeared, there would be nothing to keep it from chasing them, finding them, and consuming them. Memories of the impossibly black liquid flowing over the top of the rig, encompassing it like a death shroud, and then spilling onto the deck, which was their only place of safety, kept playing in her mind. She remembered Catfish yelling at the top of his lungs to fire the flare gun at the barrel of fuel oil on the grated deck. She remembered the look on Thomas's face, part wonder and part terror, as he stood tall in the face of death, as well as the screams of the few crew that had survived as they ran for their lives or were taken by the thing, one by one. Worst of all, she remembered the branches of deep space black rising out of the pool, their ends sprouting orbs that teemed with alien intelligence. Even against the howling wind, she had heard the crackle and crunch of the creature extruding more limbs, tentacles, and eye stalks. And those eyes, they'd all been staring at her. Or had they? She'd been terrified to fall asleep. As soon as the sun had disappeared below the horizon, her heart thumped hard in a rapid arrhythmic stumble. The lifeboat sank into impenetrable darkness, and the fun began. She focused on Catfish at first, cradling his head on her knees while she sat cross-legged on the hard deck. The white of the bandage around his head seemed to be the only remnant of color, save for the gray walls. As she started to slip into sleep, the image of a tentacle slashing through the boat's walls and crushing her like an aluminum can chased away the drowsiness in an instant. Her spine went rigid, and her body shook from the shock. Catfish moaned when her legs dislodged his head from her knees. Heart racing, eyes still darting around the cabin to make sure the thing wasn't inside with them, she gently pushed until his head returned to the cradle of her knees. He started to snore softly, the sound contrasting with the harsh spray of the water and the waves lapping against the metal hull. It took a long time before she could close her eyes again and convince herself the monster was gone. Nearly 10,000 meters below Liger, the thing that had once occupied the M2 trench had been destroyed. She was sure of it. And its progeny that had killed her boss and all the other folks on the rig, they'd burned it up. Correction, she'd burned it up. But it didn't matter. The boat rocked on the waves, the bare moonlight casting strange shadows through the portholes. Here a tentacle, there a talon, and at the back, was that an eye stalk peering at her? She didn't stop shivering until she saw the first rays of dawn break through the oppressive darkness. Then she slept. When she awoke, Catfish had somehow managed to move himself onto one of the benches. He was once more asleep and snoring loudly. She rolled him over onto his side and slid one of the life preservers beneath his wounded head. She was sure it wasn't comfortable, but it had to be better than laying directly on the hard bench. She spent the second day dozing when she wasn't checking their supplies, checking them again, and counting every drop of water she consumed. Shauna woke Catfish twice, once to give him water with some anti-inflammatories, and once to get some food down his gullet. He'd been in a daze both times, barely aware of his surroundings, but at least he flashed his shit-eating grin. That was enough to make her feel like they might live through this. Catfish was running a fever, and while he lay dead to the world, she held his hand and sat cross-legged on the floor with her back against the bench. Catfish's arm dangled over the side and touched her shoulder. Things hadn't started out that way, but after she was sure he was asleep, she'd moved his arm far enough to drape over her. He didn't seem to mind. It kept her calm for a while, his clammy skin slowly warming from her body heat. She felt like she could stay awake a little longer without panic and without fear. But then night came again. High clouds streaked across the night sky, the stars appearing and disappearing like low, stuttering strobe lights. The sliver of moonlight, larger than the night before, merely cast more shadows. The clouds scattered the light coming through the portholes, leaving horror in their wake. Instead of the tentacles and talons from the night before, it was the eyes. The goddamned eyes. They were everywhere in the darkness. Wherever she looked, another eye stalk waved at her from the shadows. Shauna didn't know how long she sat petrified with fear, too afraid to move. She knew she was squeezing Catfish's hand too hard, but didn't stop until he moaned. He was sleeping. He was safe. He might be dying from an infection, but at least the black thing couldn't get him. No, it was going to get her instead. Sometime before dawn, back screaming with pain and her legs filled with pins and needles from lack of blood flow, her eyelids became too heavy for her to keep open. She woke with a start sometime later and found herself looking at the ceiling. A shadow stared down at her. It was here. Her heart thumped loud and fast enough to make her body shiver. "It's here, girl," her late father's voice whispered in her mind. "See you soon." The shadow widened and became the entire ceiling. A giant, lifeless eye stared down at her. Another appeared below the space-black maw, which curled into a mirthless smile. Her mouth opened in a silent scream while her head filled with the sound of frying pork fat. The smell of burning hair and the fetid stench of some bathed roadkill filled her nostrils. "Shauna?" She snapped awake, arms flailing at nothing. For a moment she was sure the creature would drop down upon her, snatch her up with its teeth, and dissolve her flesh. But it was just a shadow. "Shauna!" the voice came again. She glanced to the side and saw Catfish's eyes glittering in the moonlight. He swallowed hard and then spoke through a larynx so raw and dry that it might as well have been full of broken glass. "You okay?" She quickly raised herself, reached for a bottle of water, and returned to him. "I'm fine. How are you feeling?" He raised a hand, put it on her shoulder, and managed a weak smile, his dingy teeth ghostly gray in the shadows. "It hurts, and I think I did something to my leg." She nodded. "I'll get you some medicine. Hang on." She made to move away from him, but his hand tightened on her shoulder. "What?" "Thomas didn't make it," he said softly. "No one did." "No one but us," she said. "And I don't even know how we made it." He coughed and winced. Whatever infection he had seemed to be moving into his lungs. "Very carefully," he said with a grin. "When that thing exploded, I think it must have been close to one of the shacks. Either that or the shockwave detonated it. Shrapnel all over the place. You're lucky that falling wooden beam just barely bopped you. Could have been a lot worse." "I guess so," she said. "Dragged you into the boat while—" He broke off, his eyes staring past her into the darkness. "While the others died." She shivered. She didn't know what he'd seen before they escaped Liger in the lifeboat and wasn't sure she wanted to know either. One day, maybe, but not tonight, while the sun was below the horizon and her imagination turned every shadow into a creature from a goddamn B-movie. Shauna brushed a hand against his face. "Thank you for saving my life." His grin returned in an instant. "I was glad to do it," he said, "and you're welcome." A tear tried to escape her eye, but she wiped it away before it had the chance. "Let me get you something." She patted his hand and shuffled to the emergency supply cabinet. Using the kinetic flashlight, she rummaged until she found a lever that opened the bench against the opposite wall, revealing food and water bottles. Grabbing a bottle of water, she headed back to him. Although his eyes were closed again, she could tell he wasn't asleep. "Can you sit up?" He lazily opened his eyes and squinted at her in the darkness. "Maybe with a little help." Shauna wasn't a large woman, but she easily maneuvered Catfish into a sitting position. Catfish, a little over 6 feet tall with long hair and a hint of a paunch, somehow seemed smaller, as if the events on Leaguer had diminished him. Or maybe, she thought, you've just become some sort of badass. "What are you smiling at?" She looked up at him, her cheeks flushing slightly. "Nothing. Here." She handed him the bottle of water. He took it and immediately placed the plastic nipple between his teeth. "Drink slow. I don't need you throwing up all over the place." "No, ma'am," he said. The paper packet containing the tablets opened easily between her fingers. She popped the 2 white ovals into her hand and waited for Catfish to finish sipping at the water. He finally stopped, swallowed noisily, and moaned in satisfaction. "Didn't know I'd ever miss water that much." "Well, don't miss it too much," Shauna said, "because we're surrounded by it." He blinked at her and slowly nodded before taking the pills from her, popping them into his mouth, grimacing, and taking a sip of water. "Don't happen to have any cigarettes in that damn supply chest, do you?" No," she said, narrowing her eyes. "No vape either, so don't even ask." "No energy drinks?" "Cut it out. You need to rest." She placed a hand on his forehead. He still felt too warm. "You have a fever." "No kidding," he said. "I thought it was just burning up and freezing at the same time." "You want a blanket?" He shook his head. "Not yet. Maybe in a while." He tried to turn his neck and look out the porthole, but stopped with a grunt of pain. "Any idea where the fuck we are?" "No. The SOS beacon has been going off for a while now, though. I can't imagine they don't know where we are." Catfish harumphed. "Just because they know where we are doesn't mean they're in any kind of hurry to pick us up." "What do you mean?" He shrugged. "Think about it. They knew what was happening on the rig and didn't do jack shit to help us. For all they know, this lifeboat has one of those things in it." He rubbed his arms together as if trying to warm them. "I'm surprised they haven't dropped a bomb on us." What was it Thomas had said? Fuel air bomb? She shivered again. They were lucky to have escaped the thing on the rig. She wondered how close they had come to getting obliterated by a plane from Australia. "I guess you're right," she said, her words tumbling out in a barely audible whisper. Catfish winced and held his knee, doing his best to keep the leg still. "Yeah, I think I fucked myself up pretty good." Frowning, Shauna turned the flashlight back on and shined it at Catfish's leg. A long, jagged line ran from his thigh to the shin. It didn't look to have bled much, and a fine crust of scab had already begun to cover the open wound, but his foot looked odd. The purple bruising and swelling told her he'd done a little more than just sprained his ankle. "Yeah," she said, "I think you did. We need to keep you off your feet." "Not like there's anywhere to go, but I do need to piss." She helped him to the rear of the boat and through the hatch leading to the rail. The moonlight pierced the blanket of high clouds, and for a moment Shauna couldn't breathe. It was beautiful. As far as she could see, there were only light waves, the occasional foam spray, and the moon's reflection. Whenever a hole in the clouds appeared, more stars than she'd ever seen crowded the night sky. Using her shoulder to prop himself up, he fumbled for his zipper with one hand, managed to unzip, made sure he wasn't pissing into the breeze, and let go. Shauna tried not to laugh. Of all the firsts she'd experienced over the past week or two, this was the latest. When Catfish's stream finally turned into a trickle, he bounced his member up and down, slid it back into his underwear, and struggled to rezip. "Shit," he said. I can't zip it up." Shauna rolled her eyes. "In for a penny," she thought. She snaked her free hand around and held the top of his shorts. Her fingers touched bare skin, and even as absurd as the situation was, she felt a tremble of desire. "Stop that shit," she told herself as he zipped up his shorts. "He's like a brother to you." "Okay," Catfish said. "Thank you for not making fun of me." She helped him turn around, and they staggered back into the cabin. "It was difficult," she said. "I'm sure." They reached the bench, and he managed to sit, legs hanging over the edge, back against the wall. He smiled at her. "Thank you." "Don't mention it," she said. "Just remember that if you ever have to help me take a piss." "Deal," Catfish said. "But you're the one in one piece." He shivered and rubbed his hand against his arm. "Hell of a draft coming through those doors." "That, and you need to lie down and let the meds work their way through your system. Kill that fever." "Yeah," he said. I guess. I'll close the door and get some more blankets. Try and make you more comfortable. Shit, he said. How much more comfortable can I get? Ankles blown, my head feels like it's full of broken glass, my lungs are cheese graters, I'm burning it from the inside, and you're worried about me being comfortable? Catfish? Yes. Shut the fuck up. Chapter 2. She held his hand while he slept and raged with fever. His ankle continued to balloon, and it seemed no matter how much medicine she gave him, the fever returned with a vengeance. She was beginning to worry that in a day or two it would just be her on the boat. There was little to do besides doze and listen to the sound of the waves lapping against the hull and Catfish's serrated lungs taking in air. That said, her mind started playing tricks on her. Several times, she thought she heard a helicopter in the distance. Each incident stirred her from her restless sleep and sent her to the deck to look for hope, but there was nothing but the blue sky laced with white puffy clouds and the endless water. She woke Catfish up every 6 hours to give him more medicine. Shauna didn't want to tell him they were already running out, that they had enough supply for a few more days if she rationed it, but after that, his body was either going to fight off the illness or he was going to die. No, that was not something she wanted to think about, let alone speak aloud. When she was sure Catfish was asleep, she went up on deck and vented all the grief. Thomas, JP, hell, the entire crew of Leaguer was dead, gone. If the creature hadn't consumed them, they surely perished in the fire they set to kill it, or they drowned when the rig finally sank into the abyssal. Thomas Calhoun, her late boss, had taken her under his wing and made her something more than a simple petroleum chemist. He trained her to think like an engineer. He treated her like a daughter instead of an employee, and now his body would never be found. There would be no burial. He would simply be marked as lost at sea. And JP, the former SEAL and rig diver, had been consumed by a creature after being infected. He'd never smile at her again. She'd never have to listen to him and Catfish argue over minute details as they maintained Catfish's infamous AUVs or his other gear. None of them would fantasize about spear diving and catching something huge while sharks circled them. Those conversations, those moments, could only live in memory now. The threads had been snipped once and for all, and there was no going back. The heartache was worse than being dumped or discovering your boyfriend had decided you were too straight-laced and, therefore, had affair after affair until he finally came clean without so much as a tear. This was much, much worse. But the absolute final cosmic joke was watching the last of her team, her last good friend, dying in the middle of the ocean while she could do nothing to save his life. Head in her hands and eyes full of tears, her ears picked up the chop, chop, chop of blades slicing the air. It sounded kilometers away. Had to be another auditory hallucination. She ignored it, focusing instead on the memory of Thomas's lined and kind face, his gruff voice, and the twinkle of mischief in his blue eyes, so much like her father, but so different. The sound picked up in volume. A wave, larger than the rest, crashed into the boat, making it wobble just enough to give her vertigo and knock her off balance. She caught herself before she flipped over the side railing. And then she saw it. It looked like a brick flying straight at them, its nose tilted slightly toward the water. Her tired eyes and mind finally made sense of what she was seeing. Her heart picked up speed, and she wiped away hopeful tears as it moved closer and closer. If it was an hallucination, she didn't want to know. If it was a dream, she didn't want to wake up. And when the helicopter reached them, she finally believed it was over. She and Catfish spent 2 days in Port Moresby, the capital of Papua New Guinea, in a building surrounded by men and women carrying weapons. Although he didn't enter the building, she saw one of the men through a window carrying what looked like a flamethrower. A pair of Australian doctors wearing hazmat suits checked on her every 3 hours, their faces friendly but stressed behind their helmets. Somewhere in the building, she'd no doubt Catfish was in a closed-off room like hers, IVs hooked up to his body while tests were run on every ounce of blood they could squeeze from his veins. There were no newspapers. There was no mention of what was happening in the world, no answers to her questions about PPE, Leaguer's owner, and her employer, or HAL, the Houston lab they'd sent the samples to. She hadn't expected the doctors to know anything about either company, but even if they did, she knew it was a long shot they'd tell her. They wanted her calm. They wanted her to read the romance novels they brought her. They wanted her to rest. Finally, they put something in her IV to make her do just that. On the 3rd day of her incarceration, the doctors entered her room without their bulky suits. They told her she had recovered, and while she still had a mild concussion, she was healthy and infection-free. Catfish's ankle would require minor surgery, but his concussion symptoms were fading fast, and the bacteria causing his pneumonia had lost the battle. She'd see him the next day. They ushered her against her complaints to a private jet. Then they were in Japan. Then they were airborne again and heading for the United States. The plane reached L.A. and stayed on the tarmac long enough to refuel before returning to the air. Destination? Houston, Texas. Upon landing at a private airport, Catfish was carried off on a stretcher, while she walked on rubbery legs down the air stairs and to the tarmac. The two men who had sat near her the entire flight gestured to a black SUV. Another group of men rolled Catfish's gurney to a private ambulance. "Hey, where are they taking him?" she asked the large man standing before her. He glanced down at her and said simply, "Same place as you, but he had surgery. Needs to be monitored." She shook her head. "I want to go where he's going. I mean with him." The man shook his head. "Those aren't my orders, ma'am. My orders are to get you to your destination. Please get in the back seat." Exhausted, terrified, and unsure whether or not this was a dream, Shauna opened her mouth to protest but realized there was no point. They had numbers. They had guns. She didn't. She'd have to do what they said. After climbing into the SUV's spacious back seat, she saw the partition blocking her from the windshield. She had no way to see where they were going. The SUV drove quickly away from the airport, found the freeway, and rumbled as it accelerated. She tried to look out the windows and figure out where she was, but they were tinted so strongly that she couldn't even make out road signs. Upon reaching their destination, she heard a conversation through an open window. Someone asked to see ID. Someone said, "Sir," a lot, and they were moving again for another 5 minutes. Through the reinforced glass, she barely heard the buzz of aircraft propellers. The SUV stopped, the doors opened, and she stepped out into bright sunlight beneath a blameless blue sky. Armed men escorted her into a stark concrete building. She walked through the halls while men and women in uniforms glanced at her with either mild disinterest or unease. The government had her, and she got the feeling they would never let her go.